even if the deal doesn't have a lot of room, we can still make a couple of bucks. And little tidbit on this particular deal. This was kind of because Dr. Harris had asked me to give you some of the negatives as well as the positives. This guy had a loan that had an adjustable rate. And that became a problem when it started to go up. And all of a sudden, his $800 payment turned into $900. That ended up where I basically broke even with the rent. So a little tidbit, if you're gonna agree to start paying payments in the future for somebody, make sure it's a fixed rate loan. Because if it's variable, you may wake up one Thursday morning and realize that you're no longer making any money on your deal. That's no fun. All right, so which one of these versions is better? Well, really, owner financing is kind of your only option for properties that have no loans on them. So it's kind of like having a couple of different arrows in your quiver. You can bring out one if it suits best, or bring out another depending on the situation. The subject to is nice because you become the owner. There's a real problem with lease options, and that is that if you're not the owner, that person could get liens against them, and let me tell you a war story. Okay, this brings out some pain, so if I get emotional here shortly, you'll understand why. I had done a lease option, and I had this tenant buyer in the property, and they were gonna buy it, and I was gonna make $45,000 cash. Was gonna go into my bank account. I could almost see the money. I mean, I was already dancing. I mean, this was the greatest thing since sliced bread. Well, guess what happened? Right before closing, the title company found out that the seller's wife had never paid her student loan debt. Student loan debt never goes away, y'all, unless you pay it. You can't file bankruptcy to get rid of it. It's like glue. It just sticks to you. Well, apparently she didn't tell her husband when they got married that this had happened. In fact, they got married after I'd owned the property. But in the state of Tennessee, as soon as you get married to somebody, you both own the property. So she had $70,000 in student loan debt. Now, if I would have done a subject to, I would have owned the property, and her student loan debt would not have mattered. But instead, I didn't own the property. In Tennessee, if you've got any judgments filed against you at the courthouse, those have to be paid before something is sold. $45,000 did not go into my bank account that day. In fact, it never did on that property. I had to give it back to him. That's the thing about a lease option is you can give the property back to him because you're leasing it from him. Yeah, question?
If there's a lien on your property, and can you still sell your property and then they take all the money towards the lien? Or
yeah, well, if they take over the property, they take over your lien. Now it's their problem. Okay. Now, technically, it'll still be in your name, the lien, but if they ever want to sell that property, they got to deal with it. Yeah, because what'll happen is the way the recorder's office works is when you record a deed, that doesn't necessarily disappear who the loans are. Because remember, they're separate documents. So yeah, those whatever liens are there will stick around. And I don't know that it works like that in Florida because I haven't dealt with it. But in Tennessee, the bankruptcy and collections attorneys of Tennessee, they all got together one day and figured out how to make sure they can get paid more money with doing no work. It's called making it a law that you've got to pay all the loans off before you can sell real estate.
They'll still attach in Florida.
They do? They attach in Florida?
Yeah, they won't disappear from a deed or anything.
Right, yeah, they stay there. Yeah.
If you had to go back to that situation, what would you have done?
I would have done the subject to where I became the owner. I would have just said to him, I'd have said, look, if I'm going to promise to make your payments every single month so you don't have to worry about that problem anymore, I'm going to have to be the owner. We're going to have to put this property, you're going to have to deed the property to me. I don't want to do a lease option because if I do a lease option, I had that sort of threat. Now, the other thing you could do, but you could record a second mortgage to protect your interest, but then you'd have to show that that actual money was transferred. So if you had an extra 30 grand in your bank account, you could say you lent the money to yourself, but if you don't have that money, you really can't do that. So really the best way to do it is just do a subject to, or a lease option is kind of your last case resort, but then you'd want to do a title search and make sure the person wasn't full of liens. Hey, kind of a funny little side note. If the owner said to you, they said, well, if you're going to become the owner, I still have to have some control here. There's one other thing you can do. Has anybody ever heard of a trust, a land trust? This is a really cool tidbit. Florida is one of the best states in America for doing creative real estate. The exact opposite would be Washington. Washington's like Russia. It's like communist. Whereas here's flexible. You can do all sorts of stuff. It's capitalist, right? We've lost a lot of money in Washington for deals that didn't go through because they changed laws. So what happens is in the state of Florida, you can buy real estate and the name on the deed can be a trust. UCF trust. You can name anything you want to. Superman trust, whatever you want to name it. And then the trust then has these beneficiaries. But here's the beauty. Nobody knows who the real owners are. All they see is the name of the trust. They have no idea because there's no other documentation showing who the trust owners are. So you can have complete anonymity. Now guess when the legislation was passed in Florida for the land trust. You're in Orlando. What is one of the biggest things in Orlando? When Disney was buying up all that land, he didn't want anybody to know because if all the other owners of the land saw he was buying the other stuff, they would go, ooh, my stuff's more valuable, and they'd charge him more. So the day before he bought his first property in Central Florida, the land trust legislation was passed in the state of Florida. And Disney was a big part of it. So we can thank Walt Disney. All real estate investors in Florida can thank him. So that's a really creative strategy as far as making sure nobody knows who the real owner is. And there's some real value in that at times. Because if you build a portfolio of 200 homes, all it takes is one tenant to say, ooh, here's Mr. Rich Man. I'm going to sue him. So if every property is in a different name, it'd be really hard to search and figure out all your properties. And also what that could do is, if somebody, like in that particular situation, if we moved it into a trust, I could still let that guy, his name was Orcinta Say. How could you forget losing $45,000, right? I could have had Orcinta be the beneficiary of that trust, but that would have still worked because then I wouldn't have had to deal with the student loans. The problem is when you leave it in their name long term, you could potentially not be able to sell it down the line. Are y'all having a good time? Is this fun?